After 10 years of siege, the towers of Troy were finally falling to ash. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, steered his ships toward home, convinced that the most difficult trials of his life were behind him. He and his men carried more than spoils. They carried a sense of absolute certainty. They had outsmarted the Trojans and survived the gods' whims, leading them to believe that the rules of caution no longer applied to them. This overconfidence surfaced at their first stop in the land of the Cicones. Instead of a quick resupply, the crew raided the town and stayed for days, feasting and drinking on the beach. While they celebrated, the Cicones gathered reinforcements and struck back, killing dozens of Greeks before the ships could reach open water. The disaster was a direct result of their own success. The victory at Troy had stripped away their military discipline, leaving them vulnerable to an enemy they had simply stopped taking seriously. A relentless storm caught the fleet, tearing at their sails for 9 days and pushing them beyond the known world. They were no longer sailing through familiar territory. They were drifting into a space where the dangers were no longer physical. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, the threat was a honey-sweet fruit that acted as a sedative for the soul. Those who ate it instantly lost their desire for home, their loyalty to their commander, and even their own names. They wanted only to stay and consume more. Odysseus had to drag his men back to the ships by force. He ignored their pleas and lashed them to the rowing benches, prioritizing the physical survival of his fleet above all else. Odysseus successfully maintained control over his crew through sheer authority, but his focus remained entirely on the external world. He hadn't yet realized that the same pride he used to command others was beginning to cloud his own judgment. When they reached the island of the Cyclopes, Odysseus ignored the warnings of his men. He insisted on exploring a massive cave belonging to the giant Polyphemus, not for supplies, but to see what gifts the giant offered a hero of his stature. The situation inverted instantly. Polyphemus returned, sealed the cave with a boulder the size of a hill, and began eating the men. The hero was now nothing more than a trapped animal. Standard tactics were useless. Even if Odysseus could kill the giant, his men were not strong enough to move the stone door. Their weapons and their status as warriors meant nothing against the sheer mass of the boulder. To survive this, Odysseus had to shed his identity. He had to stop being a king and become something the giant would never expect. He turned to the giant's own appetites, offering bowl after bowl of undiluted wine. He waited as the Cyclops became sluggish and incoherent, looking for a way to use the creature's size against him. When asked for his name, Odysseus executed a perfect tactical erasure. He told the giant his name was simply Nobody. This move functioned as a shield. By removing his name, he became an invisible target, leaving the giant's rage with no center to strike. While the giant slept, Odysseus and his men drove a heated wooden stake directly into his single eye. Polyphemus screamed for help, but when the other Cyclopes arrived outside, he told them nobody was hurting him, so they left him to his agony. The next morning, the men escaped by clinging to the bellies of the giant's sheep. Polyphemus felt the tops of the animals as they left the cave, but the Greek slipped past his fingers, entirely undetected. It was a masterpiece of restraint. Odysseus had saved his men not with a sword, but by having the discipline to be anonymous. The Greeks scrambled back to their ships and began to row with everything they had. They were back in the safety of the open sea, leaving the blinded, screaming giant behind on the shore. But as they pulled away, Odysseus felt a sharp internal friction. He had won the greatest victory of his life, but because he had used a false name, the world would never know it was him. He stood at the ship's stern and roared his true identity back at the island. He shouted his name, his father's name, and his kingdom, ensuring the giant knew exactly who had blinded him. There was no strategic reason for this outburst. It was an act of pure self-sabotage, driven by a need for recognition that outweighed his own survival instincts. By revealing his name, Odysseus gave the giant the only piece of information he needed to target a curse. Polyphemus called out to his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea, and asked for his enemy to be destroyed. Poseidon heard the prayer. The ocean itself became a deliberate adversary, following Odysseus across every current and tide with a focused, ancient rage. The voyage home stretched into a 10-year war against the waves. Odysseus would eventually reach Ithaca, but only after losing every ship, every man, and every shred of the glory he had fought so hard to claim. The Greeks called this hubris, the specific delusion that a person's intellect or past victories make them immune to the consequences of their own ego. In the end, Odysseus wasn't defeated by monsters or storms. He was defeated by the one thing he couldn't outsmart, his own need to be seen. True mastery isn't just about defeating the enemy in the cave. It's having the discipline to stay nobody once you've escaped.